what do you see as the most important? Do you think COVID is the most important issue for this election?
I do. I think that that is the number one thing on the forefront of voters' minds right now. And so that is going to be issue number one. The polling tells us that it's issue number one for voters in this election, which is particularly interesting from a political science perspective because this was so unexpected. And so to have campaigns adapt to this issue from that began earlier this year, and to be the forefront issue for on voters' minds is interesting and going to be something we're researching for a very long time.
How do you think, how much different do you think we would be looking at this right now without COVID, without that issue at the forefront of everything?
Well, Donald Trump's biggest campaign issue is to talk about the success of the economy. And so that would have probably been his number one platform component. And so that's a hard sell to make to a lot of people who are out of work right now and who are have potentially battled with COVID or lost a loved one or a friend or something or someone important to them to COVID. And so having COVID be at the forefront has really changed everything that we talk about. Even the politicization of masks or not wearing masks, or the election itself and how we go about voting. You know, I watched the news this morning. Well, over 100 million people voted absentee or early voting this year, which is absolutely historic. But you know, how one goes about voting has become a platform issue. And so those are just a couple of examples where COVID has really upended what the candidates may have wanted to talk about originally, but have had to make that a focal point in their campaign.
Okay, very interesting. That actually kind of leads me onto my next point. So how do you think we're immediately going to know tonight? How do you think it's going to change with them having to count all the separate votes, and the turnout is historic and it just goes in so many different ways? How do you think that's going to affect counting up the votes and everything?
Well, I think that we are very unlikely to know the outcome of the election tonight. There are some states that may be more prepared to give a pretty robust count tonight based on their different election rules. And so they might, and those would be states that have very high electoral college numbers of votes. And so which candidate wins can be pretty telling about how the outcome of the election is going to go. But in reality, we never know the final count of the election on election night. It is news broadcasts that make predictions about how the election is going to go, not the election commissions themselves. And so we're always counting votes after that night, but usually we have enough of the vote to be able to reasonably conclude how a state is going to go and therefore how the election is going to go. But I think it is really unreasonable to expect an outcome tonight. Probably in the next coming days we can have a more definitive result, and you know, and that's just in fairness to the election boards who are counting so many votes in, and also in a different format than they had originally expected.
So we've talked about how we think COVID is probably the most important issue for this election. What other big issues do you see for each candidate to help them swing voters, especially in the swing states that they really need?
Well, one thing is certainly healthcare. Healthcare is always an important issue, and it is particularly important this year, especially if, well, we know that our Supreme Court has changed, and it's possible that the Affordable Care Act could be overturned. If COVID is considered, and it's largely predicted that it will be a pre-existing condition that could really impact one's access to health care. And so there's you know, the candidates have very different perspectives on healthcare, so that could really change who one is wanting to vote for. So healthcare is very important, the economy, and also climate issues. Joe Biden has really made many statements about how this is the greatest existential threat to humanity. I think I'm summarizing his words pretty well. And so, and the Trump campaign is not consider climate issues to be so important. And so that's going to be major places of divergence when it comes to policy issues, just to name a few.
Okay. And my last question, kind of on the same topic. Do you think people are going to trust, because we know President Trump did have a strong economy before COVID hit. Do you think voters are going to trust him enough to get that economy back up? Or do you think that's something he's really going to have to fight for, is hoping that voters do trust him?
Well, it just really depends on which voter that you have, because his base would say absolutely yes. People who are very strong Biden supporters would say, oh, probably not. And if so, please describe for me in detail how you're going to go about doing that. How do we manage the fact that through these stimulus packages, well, how do we ultimately pay for this? And would that impact how our tax structure is set up? And so, it's really hard to answer that question with any level of certainty, because it really just depends on who you ask on whether or not those individuals trust Donald Trump to bring the economy back, even though that is his greatest issue area, because one would have to believe that he was the sole reason why the economy was doing well in the first place.
Welcome back. Before anything else, we'd like to inform you we have just learned Donald J. Trump was called for Oklahoma. He has won the state.
Back to the interview with Aaron and Dr. Shauna. Aaron, will you please elaborate more on what you learned with that interview?
I think the most interesting thing was there seems to be a very strong focus on the economy. Dr. Pageant was telling me she wasn't sure that, given that COVID's shaken everything up so much over the past several months, it's crazy to think just how different of a race we'd be in right now if it wasn't for COVID, because as we know, Trump did build a strong economy, and that is something that he was really looking to rely on and is still relying on. But it's really interesting to see how he is able to rely on that economy now that COVID has hit, and it really shook up his plan for the entire race.
Yeah, I completely agree with you there, where COVID has really impacted our elections and whether it's swaying people, left or right. Besides the federal elections, there are a lot of state and local candidates waiting for returns to roll in.
But what is it like to be a candidate on election night? For special insight, let's go to ENN's Grace Ann, who's with former state representative Todd Thompson.
Tonight I'm here with former state representative Tom Thompson. Todd, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I served in the state legislature from 2006, whenever I was first elected, until I termed out in 2018, and really knew very little about the process, about politics. Asked myself why I even ran at some point during it, and ended up having one of the closest races in state history whenever I ran that first race. In fact, I lost by 2 votes, and we did a complete recount of all of our 10,000 votes, and I won by 2. So that was an interesting experience to start off my political career with.
What is it like to be a candidate on election night?
So when you campaign, it takes a long time, it takes a lot of effort. So you spend a lot of time knocking on doors, mailing stuff to people, going to events, and making phone calls, all that kind of stuff. So the night of the election is a lot of relief, because you've done all that work, and so there's a lot of relief, but there's also a lot of those emotions of, did I do enough? what could I have done different? Why didn't I do this? And there's also the nerves, because on legislative races, there's not a lot of polling that's done, so you really kind of go into the election night pretty blind, not knowing, and so even though you might think that you're doing well, even though you might think that, oh, your friends do like you, you always wonder, is anybody going to vote for me? Am I even going to get a vote? And then can I win? And so there's a lot of nerves.
What type of campaign do you think works best? Yard signs, commercials, etc.?
Well, I was always told that signs don't vote, and so the very best, especially on a state legislative race, the very best thing you can do is go out and knock doors and meet people. And the more you can meet people, the more you can attend events. That's really the best campaigning. You're always going to have to do mailers, radio commercials, if you have the money to do TV, stuff like that, to get your name out there. But it comes down to people want to know if they can trust you and if they believe in you, and they only gain that by talking to you one-on-one.
Thank you. Back to Maycee and Aaron.
Thank you, Grace Ann. Oklahomans are also voting on several issues that impact the entire state.
ENN's Kaelyn Smith with longtime political consultant and pollster Pat McFerron about what else is on the ballot this year.
I'm Kaelyn Smith, and today I'm talking with Pat McFerron. And one of the topics that we'll be focusing on today is the state ballot and all of the different questions on it. So my first question for you is how do state questions get on the ballot?
Oh, there are actually two different ways that state questions can get on the ballot in Oklahoma. One of those, and we've got great examples this year. State question 805, that state question was put on the ballot by gathering signatures. It is based on the number required is based on how many people voted in the last election cycle. It's you have 90 days to collect those signatures, and then you turn them in. The Secretary of State's office counts them. And then there are quite a few other steps in there, but that is one. It is the initiative petition process where someone collects the signatures. The other is a legislative approach, and the state legislature can submit to the vote of the people a question to be answered, and that's what state question 814 is.
Thank you so much. That's really good. Will the state legislator look any different after the election in terms of Republicans versus Democrats?
Not fundamentally. I think there'll be a change of a couple in the state house, probably toward the Republican side. And the Senate, I think most people think that it's going to be either the same or a change of one seat in either direction. So this is not from a state legislative standpoint, this is not going to be a big sea change in who controls the state legislature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know you kind of already mentioned a few of these, but what are some of the state issues people are voting on in this election?
Well, we have obviously, there's only one statewide race, that is for corporation commissioner. And then we'll have state legislators and half of the state Senate that people will vote on. And then in counties, different counties will have different races, of course, but county clerk, county sheriff, court clerk are all up this election cycle, as well as some of the county commissioner seats as well. So those are the candidate races we have. We also have retention ballots for judges at 3 different levels. We have the state Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land for civil cases and do all the interpretations of the laws. We have the Court of Criminal Appeals, which is the court of last resort for criminal convictions in the state. And then also the Civil Appeals Court, which is the step below the Supreme Court. When it comes to judges, we vote to either retain or replace them. The reality is in Oklahoma, we've never had a judge voted to be replaced. If that were to happen, there's a process where the governor would eventually appoint that replacement. But it's called a retention ballot. and it keeps judges from having to run in sort of partisan environments and against other judges. So we then do have the two state questions we mentioned before. State question 805 is the initiative petition that came forward. It is a very hotly contested contest at this time. This state question has the goal of reducing the state's incarceration rate. It does so by taking away a tool used by prosecutors, judges, and juries to use a criminal's past convictions to extend their sentence. It does away with this. It defines in our Constitution the term violent felony. The opponents of this point out that the way they've made this definition, it omits crimes like animal cruelty, even domestic violence, some elements of child predators from that definition of violent. And so it's a very complicated issue that out-of-state interests have spent at least $7 million trying to get that passed. Just really kind of a grassroots organization against that state question. The other state question is also very technical. We have a tobacco settlement endowment trust, where proceeds from a tobacco lawsuit settlement of a couple of decades ago, where that money is reserved and protected from the legislature spending it. This would change part of that allocation, so the legislature could use some of that money to fund the recently passed Medicaid expansion we have, but it would take it away from TSET, the Tobacco Settlement Endowment Trust, which has a stated mission to improve the health of Oklahomans. They use that money for tobacco cessation programs. You might have seen the 1-800-QUIT-NOW tobacco helpline. They do that advertising, that effort. And they also do other things like help fund the Stevenson Cancer Center and recruiting physicians to Oklahoma.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's really interesting. Something else is, what can people vote on when it comes to LGBT rights? Is that something that we can see on the state ballot this year?
No, I don't think we see anything there at all on the ballot this year in Oklahoma.
Okay, thank you. And how has the environment been affected? Or how are people looking at it this year with the election? How that's affecting it?
What environment are you speaking about? The climate environment? Are you talking about the electoral environment?
Climate, yes. Climate change, or how are people voting on that? Is there different things that are being voted on?
I think you probably see that represented in the presidential race as much as anything else. I think I neglected to mention Congress and U.S. Senate as well that people will vote on. That tends to be more of a national issue right now, but there's nothing directly on that issue on the ballot.
Okay. And how will people's votes this year be affecting state problems? How will your vote on state problems affect this election?
Well, this is one of the odd years in that it's a federal election primarily. It's driven by the presidential race, and again, we only have the one corporation commission race that's a statewide. But your legislators and senators will focus on many state issues, and again, the entire state House of Representatives was up for re-election this year. Some of those were decided when there was only one person filing for the office, or were decided in the partisan primaries. But still, there are a lot of those up for election here, and they will handle. There'll be 2,000 to 3,000 probably pieces of legislation introduced during the next 2 years while they'll be serving, dealing with state issues from any wide range of topics, everything from job development, recruitment, teacher pay, what kind of parental choice parents have when it comes to school options, There will be issues from very mundane things about how wildlife species are protected in the state, and to how conditions in our veteran centers are handled, the data privacy. There would just be, it's a little daunting to think about how many different issues our state legislators really deal with.
Yes, thank you so much. And that's all the questions I have for you today. Thank you so much again for joining us. And that's all I have. And back to you.
I'm hitting record.
Thanks, Kaelyn. Just a reminder, Donald Trump has been called for Oklahoma, and I've also just learned that Biden has won Vermont, New Jersey, Maryland, Massachusetts, and Washington, D.C.
Now, let's check in on the returns with Jensen McKee and Raelea Lemons.
Thank you. As you can see, Biden has won in Vermont, Illinois, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, has been won in these states, and Trump has won in these states. Currently, Biden is in the lead with 85 electoral votes, and Trump is trailing with 55. Here's Raelea Lemons with Stephanie Weiss versus Kendra Horn.
An update on Stephanie Bice and Kendra Horn is that Stephanie Bice has 1,159 votes and Kendra Horn has 880. Stephanie Bice is winning by 379 votes.
Thanks, Jensen and Raelea. One of the concerns on the national level is over the presidency. This country has long bragged about the peaceful transition of power through our elections. Will that hold up? Between the pandemic and protests all across the country, what will the end of this election look like? For answers to this question, we turn to ENN's Anya White.
I'm hitting record, and the recording is going well. So, Anya, I am going to turn off my audio and then wait a few seconds, and you can take it away.
Awesome, thank you. As a professor of political science at OCCC, I had just a couple questions to ask you regarding the election, since this is your area of forte, let me say. One of the questions being, how do you think COVID will affect voter turnout at the polls? Because I know a lot of people are particularly cautious in how they go about crowds and stuff like that these days.
You asking about, kind of state. No, Anya, what we have seen nationwide and even in the state are record numbers of turnout. And I don't believe that COVID is having an effect on people. I voted early because I have lots of responsibilities today. And I saw lots of people wearing masks. I saw lots of people distancing in the polling place where I voted early. I waited 3 hours and 10 minutes. And that had been like that at that polling place for 3 days. I went by my normal polling place this morning, and the parking lot had no more spaces to park a car in. So the turnout, at least this morning early when the polls opened, was very high. We are setting records in places like Texas already before today's vote. So I understand that it could be a concern from people. We've certainly seen that in how many absentee ballots have been returned, which is also a record. But I think people are more motivated to go vote in some shape or form than they are about COVID.
Awesome. Well, that makes me very happy to hear. And that I think that it's great that people are taking the proper precautions as outlined by the CDC to protect everybody. And that kind of brings me to my next question, which is what are the implications or the expected outcome of the 2020 election for the U.S. health policy? How do you think that's going to play out in our future, in our country's future?
We obviously have a candidate who nationally is tied to Obamacare, or as he's now referred to it, Biden care, and will cover pre-existing conditions. I don't know. It is a very costly proposition, Biden care and Obamacare. And we need to see, the cost projections have been out of sight, but we need to see how that's going to be paid for. And on the other side, we have a candidate who is very much against Biden care and has said that private health care options are suitable and affordable. And so there's a big difference there. At the state level, we obviously have a proposition in the state question that will take the tobacco settlement money and reduce it down to 25% for those tobacco cessation programs and increase the funding at the state level for expanded Medicare costs. And we've already passed a state question that says that voters are in favor of that. So I believe for the average Oklahoman, especially those that are not qualified for federal supplements for health care, but are above the poverty line, but still in that class where they do not get government provided health care, this will expand that. So I think your question about health care is a great one. And I think that more Oklahomans, especially if that state question passes, to fund the increase above the poverty line for people's Medicare, Medicaid, funding, that will help a lot of Oklahomans.
Yeah, thank you. Definitely thank you for addressing that. I feel like that was a major key issue that's going to come up in our current health climate and our current political climate as well. I had another question for you that ranges on the slightly more controversial side, because I feel that it is a big issue and it has been a big issue in these past couple months, especially. People have been very vocal about it. How do you think our current, I know you can't speak for our current political candidates, but how do you think our current presidential candidates feel about systemic racism? I feel like it's really systematic at this point, but then again, who am I to judge? So yeah, I would like to hear your thoughts on how you feel about that whole situation, because it really has become a major political issue in our country in the past couple months with the deaths of several Black people in relation to police brutality, all that good stuff. Not good, not what I meant. Please share your thoughts on that, ma'am.
It is very concerning to me today to know that the White House is surrounded by non-scalable barriers as a preventative measure for what could occur tonight when the election results are coming in. I am in hopes that we have a very clear, clean electoral result nationally. And I am concerned that either way this turns out, whoever wins, we could see a increase in violence and in non-acceptance of voting. And we definitely have a candidate who says that it's all fake and that it's rigged. And I am in hopes that voters will reject that and that we can have, as we always have, a peaceful transition of power. That is ultimately important in a democracy. And I do believe that there will be some protests. We've seen those, you're right. And that there are concerns about how we deal with defunding police and with our safety and security, which for most people is right up there at the top of things that they expect politicians and elected officials to take care of.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. I think that a lot of people feel like their voices aren't being heard, and that's why they feel that they have to turn to violent protests in order to get like our elected officials' attention. And so I'm definitely also hoping for a smooth election night, and I hope that everything in that sense goes well. Yeah. And I think that with regards to all the defunding police movements that have popped up recently, like ACAB, stuff like that, I think you have in any group,
Me?
Yeah, you go.
Okay, thank you, Anya. Before we go any farther, we would like to tell you that Biden is currently winning Texas by 2%, and Trump has been called for Florida. So, a bit of a turn of events there. We'll keep you updated on how that's going.
And now we turn to ENN's Grace Ann and State Representative Todd Thompson doing a short interview.
So we're back with Todd, and I'm
I just skipped over the conversation.
about the state questions. State question 805 and state question 814. Can you tell us a little bit about state question 805?
Yeah, I believe 805 is criminal justice reform that basically limits how much a judge can sentence an individual that has repeated offenses.
Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about state question 814?
So 814 directs that 75% of the money that currently goes to the tobacco settlement fund, that would go to the state legislature to be used to help fund Medicaid expansion.
Okay. Do you think these questions, these state questions, do you think they're going to pass or not?
I think with every state question, it takes a lot of effort for the groups that are supporting them to really get information out about what that state question actually does. Because whenever you walk in to a poll, sometimes the state question isn't really clear. So if people don't have a clear understanding, I think their typical reaction is to vote no, because I don't really know what I'm doing. So I think the key is going to be how well everybody that supports those different measures have educated the public about that. I'm not sure, but it seems like what we were told is currently they're both losing. So I don't know how that'll continue to play out. But I think that would tell me that a lot of people are just saying, I'm not sure, so I'm going to vote no just in case.
Yeah, that's it.
Well,
thank you.
You know, the one thing I was going to tell you that I think is important is every time there's a state question that's on the ballot, that makes a constitutional change, but inevitably there are laws that legislators have to come in and tweak to modify and help implement that. If 814 does not pass, the legislature in this budget time is still going to have to fund the Medicaid expansion, because we voted as a state that we wanted that. And so they are going to have to find the money to do that, a funding source, and we're in an economic downturn. So it's going to be very challenging for the legislature.
Do you think most of the people are going to vote no because they really don't want the state question to pass, or just because they don't know what it's about?
I think typically there's a lot of people that just don't know. So that would be my gut, is that I'm not certain what it would do. I don't want to mess something up, and so if I say no, then nothing's changed. And you know, criminal justice reform is spooky. There are some there's always some the devil's in the details, so to speak, where certain things can maybe not be quite at what they seem or what they've been portrayed, and so people are hesitant and cautious. I know that's the way it is with 805 and 804. You know, people maybe just don't understand exactly how that works.
Thanks, Todd. Back to Maycee and Aaron.
We've already explored many of the reasons people are going to the polls, but one we haven't talked about is the environment. ENN Solomon Cephas has more.
Issues that are going on during this election how do you believe they will influence the election?
That's a really great question. And, you know, when Donald Trump was first elected, he decided to pull us out of the Paris Climate Agreement, which was an agreement across the entire world amongst the majority of countries to say that this is how we're going to move forward to stop the impacts of climate change. And so that demonstrated that is an issue area of this administration where they felt that the economic cost of being part of that agreement was greater than the benefit to the United States. And so, but if you are concerned about climate change, if you're seeing the wildfires in the western part of the country that keep happening and getting worse and more historic, or if you're seeing Australia on fire, or you're seeing the hurricanes that just keep hitting the Gulf over and over again, and these extreme weather events, especially if that's impacting you individually, then you might have more stronger feelings about the impact of climate change and whether or not that should be considered in your vote. And so since 2016, which when climate change was already a major issue, we're also seeing even larger greater climate events, and we're seeing that our administration does not consider that to be a high priority over other priorities. And so I think that this is going to be an issue area that has really influenced the vote as we know more about climate change, and we also have more populations in the United States that are impacted by major natural disasters and weather events.
What do you believe whoever gets elected would need to do to change or better our environment?
Well, I think that it's important that we listen to scientists and we rely on their expertise, and expertise that we pay for as taxpayers through like our university research programs and all the different labs across the country, and listen to the collaborative scientific body about what do we know that is happening, what do we know are the long-term and short-term impacts, and then what can we tangibly do about it? And importantly, what is that going to cost? Because that is important too. We see examples from the Green New Deal, which is, it's called the Green New Deal because it is a sweeping piece of legislation that is being proposed. And so whoever's elected might say, I don't necessarily know I want to adapt this entire Green New Deal, but are there parts of it that could be adopted that to the best long-term benefit of the American citizens? And are there ways that if we adopt this, we can actually save money and save lives over not doing anything at all? It is very expensive to rebuild cities and to rebuild homes and all of the things that are impacted by natural disasters and strengthened storms and these major weather events. And so how can we really be very efficient in our policy proposals? And I think that whoever is elected needs to look to that, because we continue to see examples of where the climate is changing. And so we need to figure out how to adapt accordingly for our economic and our physical health.
That's all I think I have for you today.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Back to you. How do you believe?
Thank you, Solomon. Just a quick update. We're focusing primarily on swing states right now. Some interesting data. They're looking good for Biden. Pennsylvania, Biden has a 60% lead right now. Ohio, he has a 12% lead. And Texas, he's surprisingly winning by 2%. What do you think are some of the most interesting things we've learned today?
I thought Solomon's interview that we just went over was actually really interesting. Could you tell me more about what you learned in that?
I think it's really interesting to see how much the two sides differ on the issue, because one side is seeing it as really just our future, it's such a big deal, and then the other side sees it as, it's not something that we really need to stress. And so seeing how much the two campaigns differ in their focus on that, I think is really interesting. And clearly from the interview, it's being seen by everyone just how much of a difference there is in the campaign and the candidates' focus on it.
I think it's, that's really true. This is deciding our future. As minors, we can't even vote for our next candidate. Okay. Back to Jensen and Raelea for a check-in on our returns.
Like Aaron said, currently Biden is winning in most of the swing states. Currently, Biden is leading in with electoral votes of 85, and Trump is trailing with 61. Since we last checked in, Arkansas has been won by Trump, and Virginia has been won by Biden. Here's Raelea Lemons with the latest.
The update on Kendra Horn and Bice is Kendra Horn is losing by 300 or the update on Kendra Horn and Stephanie Bice. Kendra Horn is losing by over 1,000 votes. Stephanie Bice has over 5,000 votes total, and Kendra Horn has 4,758 total.
So recently there's been a lot of ice storms and weather trouble in Oklahoma, bringing down some of the sites, and some sites are even running on generators. What do you think are some problems that might cause, Aaron?
Well, obviously there's going to be a lot of issues, power, and then I am curious if this has affected anyone with their ability to go vote, because obviously last week was so unexpected. I am curious if some residents in Oklahoma have struggled to get out to the booths as they planned after such a crazy week last week.
I think that will definitely throw off some of our voting, make it a lot more swayed as we go further into the week. And now back to Grace Ann with James Davenport with another short interview.
Hi, I'm back with James Davenport. James, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, I am a professor of political science at Rose State College.
Thank you. How long do you think that this election is going to drag out with the mail-in ballots and early voting?
It could be, depending on how long states allow the mail-in ballots to come in before they count them, it could be the end of the week before we have some states fully in. Whether or not that makes a difference in the ultimate result, we don't know yet, because it kind of depends on which states that is. If Pennsylvania takes a while, that could delay an ultimate decision. If some of the smaller states have a little bit longer period of time to get that in, they may not make as much difference.
So how does the mail-in ballots work?
Well, each state is a little bit different. Their rules are different according to the state legislatures that pass them. In Oklahoma, there was a deadline of requesting a mail-in ballot by last week. And then you have in Oklahoma, until 5 p.m. of election day to get your ballot into the state election board. And so whether that's postmarked, some people will hand deliver their mail-in ballots, but you have until election day to get those in.
How do you think that the mail-in ballots and early voting are going to affect the election?
It's not clear yet. I mean, it's all about turnout and whose voters turns out. We have seen high turnout in both the mail-in ballots and the early voting. So Oklahoma has both. You can mail in your ballot, or you can in-person early vote the weekend before Election Day. We saw very high turnout in both of those. So what we don't know yet is that going to be counterbalanced by a moderate to maybe even a slightly lower turnout on Election Day, or is Election Day going to be very high as well? Indications are, just kind of anecdotally looking around different precincts, that we've had very high turnout on Election Day as well. So it looks like a lot of people are voting, and a lot of people took advantage of being able to vote early and vote absentee in Oklahoma.
Do you think that COVID-19 is going to affect the election?
I think it was one reason why you saw a lot more of turnout in the mail-in ballots and maybe even the early voting. I don't know that it's going to make a difference in how or who people vote for, but the manner in which they vote might have changed as a result.
Thank you, James. Back to Maycee and Aaron.
The final election returns are going to be coming in all night and maybe even later than that. For one last look here, we're going to throw it back to Jensen and Raelea one more time to look at our board.
Thank you. There's been no big changes, but Raelea Women's has a big update for these.
Kendra Horn is now in the lead by over 20,000 votes. Stephanie Bice is at 40,000 votes, and Kendra Horn is at 60,000. Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit more about the candidates, the issues, and the questions surrounding the 2020 election. We're going to sign off for now and let you go back to watching your returns on your favorite news source. But thank you for joining us in this live broadcast by the students of Epic News Network.